The tension in the classroom feels suffocating. The hum of whispered conversations fills the air as the teacher, Mrs. Langley, stands at the front of the room, explaining the day's lesson on racial inequality. The classroom, a mix of eager but oblivious faces, feels like a space divided by unspoken lines. Lines that Marcus can't ignore no matter how hard he tries. Marcus Thompson, seated near the back, shifts slightly in his seat. He's always been aware of the differences, the weight of being the only black student in a class full of students who, for the most part, have never had to grapple with the kind of prejudice he faces daily. His mind races as he listens to the class discussion unfold. His hand shoots up. Mrs. Langley nods in his direction, a polite smile on her face as if she expects another one of his thoughtful, articulate responses. It's what they all expect of him, after all. A model student. The kind of black student that is allowed to excel if he proves himself worthy. "Marcus," Mrs. Langley says, gesturing for him to speak. Marcus takes a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. This is it. The moment he can share his perspective, challenge the narrow view everyone here seems to hold. He stands, his voice steady despite the anxious flutter in his chest. "I think we have to look beyond just the personal acts of racism we see, like people saying slurs or denying opportunities. The real issue is how the system is designed. The way it makes opportunities unequal from the start. It's institutional racism, not just individual prejudice." A few heads nod around the room, but Marcus notices a subtle tightening in Mrs. Langley's eyes. She's listening, but only barely. He can feel it, the invisible walls that separate him from truly being heard. But he pushes forward, determined to speak his truth. "We can't just fix things by changing a few people's attitudes. We have to change the whole system, the whole structure. We need to look at how schools, the justice system, and even housing policies have always been designed to keep people of color at a disadvantage." There's a pause. A few of the students exchange glances, the discomfort palpable. Mrs. Langley clears her throat, her polite smile slipping just a little. "Well, Marcus," she begins, her tone light but condescending, "I think what you're saying is admirable, but it's a bit idealistic, a bit oversimplified, don't you think? The world isn't just divided into good and bad. There's nuance in these issues. Perhaps you're a little too passionate about it?" Marcus feels the sting immediately, his words, carefully chosen, reduced to nothing more than idealism. It's not just the dismissal of his argument, it's the way his perspective is invalidated, as though he can't possibly understand the complexity of the very thing he's lived every day. His throat tightens, the humiliation burns. He looks around, searching for an ally, someone who will stand up and say something, but the room is silent. His peers look anywhere but at him, complicit in the quiet racism of not speaking out. There's a dull ache in his chest. He sits back down, the weight of Mrs. Langley's words pressing on him like a physical burden. He feels small. His mind starts to race. Maybe he is oversensitive. Maybe he's wrong to feel this way. But the words still sting, echoing through. His mind. Idealistic. Oversimplified. The ideas he spent years shaping now seem worthless in the face of a system that continually tells him that no matter how hard he works, no matter how much he achieves, he will never truly belong. The bell rings, signaling the end of class, but Marcus remains seated for a moment, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. The other students shuffle out too quickly, eager to leave. He gathers his books, but his mind is far from the rest of the day's tasks. Outside, the crisp autumn air hits his face like a shock, but it doesn't offer relief. He walks home alone, his thoughts heavy and chaotic. His mother's voice rings in his head, soothing yet sharp. "The world won't make room for you, Marcus. You have to make your own space." He tries to process what happened, but the feelings swirl together. Anger, shame, confusion. He tries to convince himself it's not a big deal. After all, Mrs. Langley didn't mean to hurt him. She's probably just trying to help him understand. But the hurt lingers, settling deep in his gut. "Why do I always have to fight to be heard?" Marcus mutters to himself as he walks. "Why can't they just listen?" He stops for a moment, standing on the sidewalk under a flickering streetlight. The reflection of his face in the glass of a nearby store catches his eye. For a brief second, he feels like a stranger to himself, like he's been trying to prove his worth to a world that's never cared to listen. His mother's words break through the haze of self-doubt. We fight, but we fight smart. A slow fire begins to ignite inside him. It's quiet, but it's there. He'll never stop fighting. Not just for himself, but for all of them. For every black student who has ever been overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel other. He can't let this stand. I won't let them define me, he whispers to the night, his resolve solidifying. I'll make them hear me. Later that night, Marcus sits at his desk, the weight of the day still pressing on him. But now there's something different in the air, a sense of purpose. His grades, his academic success have always been his shield, the thing that protected him from the world's cruelty. But now it's his weapon. He picks up a pen and starts to write. He writes about the injustice. He writes about the barriers. He writes about the silent racism he faces every day. And he writes with a fire that's just begun to burn bright, because he knows deep down this fight is far from over. But it's not a fight he'll back down from. It's a fight that will lead him to change the system. It starts with his words. It starts with him. This day will be the beginning of his transformation. He will rise from this humiliation, fueled by a deep desire to change things, not just for him, but for every person of color who has been told that their voice doesn't matter. And one day, when the system is forced to reckon with the harm it's caused, Marcus will stand tall. He will make sure his voice is heard, and no one will ever again tell him that he's too idealistic. Marcus, staring at his textbook, voice low. I'm tired. The words hang in the air. He's sitting at his desk, the glow of his laptop illuminating his face. His fingers hover over the keyboard, but the words won't come. The assignments blur together, the expectations weighing on him like a stone pressing against his chest. He was always the one who had to work twice as hard, the star student, the kid who defied the odds. But after what happened in class, the feeling of not being enough claws at his confidence. He wonders if it's even worth it, if he'll ever be seen for more than the color of his skin. Marcus, to himself, voice breaking. What's the point? Devin, leaning against the locker. Yo, man, you good? Marcus barely looks up. His best friend Devin watches him carefully, concern in his eyes. He's noticed the shift, the way Marcus has started walking with his head down, the way he's been pulling back. Marcus, I'm fine, it's a lie. Devin knows it, but he doesn't push. He just nods, offering a fist bump. Marcus hesitates before bumping back, the small act of brotherhood grounding him for a moment. But as soon as Devin walks away, the loneliness creeps back in. It's exhausting pretending everything is okay. He glances at his other classmates. They laugh easily, their burdens light, unaware of what it feels like to carry an invisible weight every single day. Mrs. Langley, smiling, patronizing. Marcus, since you always have such strong opinions on these topics, why don't you give us the black perspective? The words hit like a slap. He stiffens. Here it is again, being singled out, being expected to speak for an entire race as if his identity is a monolith, as if he is nothing beyond it. His fingers clench into fists under the desk. He doesn't want to play this game today, but he knows if he refuses, it'll just prove whatever bias she already holds, that he's difficult, ungrateful. Marcus, measured but firm. I'm not sure I can give you the black perspective, ma'am, but I can give you my perspective. A murmur spreads through the classroom. Mrs. Langley's smile falters for a fraction of a second before she recovers. Mrs. Langley, of course, dear, go ahead. But he knows she isn't listening. Not really. She's waiting for the right moment to dismiss him again, just like she always does. His mother's voice echoes in his head, a memory from years ago. Linda Thompson, soft but firm. Baby, you have to be twice as good just to get half as much. That's not fair, but it's real. Little Marcus had nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the weight of what she was saying. Linda Thompson, cupping his face. You're going to be great, Marcus, but the world is going to make you fight for it. Back in the present, Marcus exhales sharply, willing himself to focus. But the weight of that truth presses against him harder than ever. He walks into a convenience store after school, just wanting to grab a bottle of water. But the cashier's eyes are on him the moment he enters. Cashier, suspicious. Need help finding something? Marcus clenches his jaw. The question sounds innocent enough, but he recognizes the tone. He's been in this moment before, followed, watched. As if he doesn't belong here. Marcus, quiet, just getting water. He moves to the back of the store, feeling the cashier's gaze burning into his back the entire time. The weight of it, of never being trusted, of always being questioned, settles deep in his bones. Mrs. Langley, shaking her head dismissive. Marcus, I think you're taking this too personally. The final humiliation. He had put effort into his final project, poured his heart into it. And once again, Mrs. Langley waves it away like it means nothing. His classmates don't speak up. No one ever does. Something inside him cracks. The exhaustion, the frustration, the years of feeling like he had to prove himself, all of it rushes forward like a tidal wave. Marcus, voice shaking but strong, no, I'm not. The classroom falls silent. Mrs. Langley blinks in surprise. Marcus, I'm tired of being told my experience isn't real. I'm tired of my words being dismissed. I'm tired of people like you pretending racism is just some debate topic instead of something I live with every single day. A long pause. Mrs. Langley's face tightens, her discomfort evident. She isn't used to being challenged like this. Marcus waits for her to say something, anything, but she doesn't. He exhales, gathering his things. The room watches as he walks out, his steps steady, his heart racing. For the first time, he isn't afraid of what they'll say about him. He's done playing their game. Later that night, Marcus stares at his college application. He hesitates, then starts typing. He doesn't want to stay here, in this place that has tried to diminish him at every turn. He wants more. He deserves more. As he writes, something shifts inside him. He realizes that leaving isn't running away, it's choosing himself. For the first time, he feels like he's making a decision for him, not for anyone else. He refuses to let this place define him. He will be the one to define his future. He presses submit. College is a breath of fresh air. He joins a student, activist group, surrounded by people who see him, who understand. For the first time, he doesn't feel like he has to fight for space in the conversation. He is heard. Student leader, smiling. We need voices like yours, Marcus. He smiles back. This is where he belongs. Years later, Marcus stands on a stage, looking out at a crowd of young black students. He remembers the boy he used to be, the one who felt small, the one who thought his voice didn't matter. Marcus, to the crowd, they told me I was too much, that my ideas were too radical, that I was too angry. A beat. His voice grows stronger. Marcus, but I wasn't, and neither are you. The audience erupts into applause. He locks eyes with his mother in the crowd. She nods. The boardroom is filled with murmured conversations as the school district officials shuffle through stacks of papers. The tension is thick, the weight of an impending confrontation looming in the air. Marcus Thompson sits at the head of the table, his expression calm but unreadable. The years have sharpened him, his confidence, his purpose. He is no longer the boy Mrs. Langley once dismissed. He is the one in control now. Superintendent Harris clears throat. Mr. Thompson, thank you for being here today. Your organization's findings regarding discriminatory practices in our district are concerning. We want to ensure we handle this properly. Marcus, measured. Unwavering. I appreciate that, Superintendent. My team has conducted an extensive review, and what we've uncovered isn't just concerning, it's systemic. Patterns of disciplinary disparities, biased curriculum representation, a school culture that repeatedly silences black students. These issues didn't appear overnight, and they won't be fixed with a single policy change. There's a rustle of discomfort in the room. Across from Marcus, a familiar face stiffens. Mrs. Langley. Her once proud posture seems smaller now, her hands clasped together. She hadn't expected to see him again, not like this. Mrs. Langley, forcing a smile. Marcus. What a surprise. I had no idea you were leading this effort. Marcus, steadily. It's Mr. Thompson. A pause. The weight of the correction lingers. Mrs. Langley shifts uncomfortably. Mrs. Langley. Soft laugh. Of course, Mr. Thompson, I must say, I'm impressed. You've done well for yourself. Marcus, cool, direct. Despite the obstacles, the meaning is clear. Mrs. Langley's smile falters. She exhales, nodding slowly as she flips through the reports in front of her, buying herself time. She isn't ready for this moment, this reckoning. Mrs. Langley clears throat. I read through some of the cases in your report. You should know, none of us ever intended to, Marcus, firm. Intended to what? Silence. Mrs. Langley hesitates, glancing around the room for support. No one comes to her aid. Marcus, leaning forward, to make students feel less than, to diminish their voices. To reinforce the idea that no matter how intelligent they are, they will always be judged first by the color of their skin. His voice is steady, but there's something deeper beneath it. The years of frustration, of buried anger, of knowing that the very system meant to educate had instead tried to silence him. Mrs. Langley, defensive. That was never my intention. I've always been fair to all my students. Marcus lets out a slow breath, shaking his head. He expected this. The refusal to acknowledge, the need to defend. He has spent years preparing for this moment. Marcus, calm but cutting. Fair, he leans back, crossing his arms, letting the words settle between them. Marcus, was it fair when you dismissed my contributions in class? When you questioned my intelligence in front of my peers? When you asked me to speak on behalf of my entire race like I was a walking encyclopedia of blackness? Mrs. Langley opens her mouth, but no words come. Marcus, was it fair when you told me I was too idealistic for believing racism wasn't just about individuals, but about institutions? Because that's exactly what I'm here proving today, that this system, this district, has been designed to hold students like me back. The air in the room is thick. Mrs. Langley looks away. The guilt is there, but so is the discomfort. A part of her still wants to believe she did nothing wrong. Superintendent Harris, clearing his throat. Mr. Thompson, I think we can all agree that the school system needs to do better. The data speaks for itself. The question now is, what action steps do you propose? Marcus doesn't hesitate. Marcus, first acknowledgement. Real acknowledgement. Not empty apologies, not vague commitments to improvement, but a direct admission that this district has failed students of color. Then, action. Policy reform. Staff training that isn't performative. An overhaul of disciplinary measures that disproportionately target black students. A curriculum that represents the truth, not just the sanitized version of history. The room absorbs his words. Some nod. Some look uncomfortable. Mrs. Langley exhales sharply, folding her arms. Mrs. Langley, softly. People can change, Marcus. Marcus. After a pause, I believe that. His voice is softer now, but there's still steel beneath it. Marcus, but change starts with accountability, and that's where so many people fail. Mrs. Langley lowers her gaze. She doesn't speak again. As the rally winds down, Marcus steps off the stage. His gaze finds his daughter standing at the front, eyes wide with admiration. She grins up at him, beaming. Zora, excited, proud. Dad, you were amazing. Marcus kneels down, brushing a hand over her curls. Marcus, you think so? Zora nods firmly. Yeah, when I grow up, I want to be just like you. His heart clenches. He pulls her into a hug, his voice quiet but full of emotion. Marcus, no, baby girl. You're gonna be better than me. She giggles, squeezing him tightly. He holds on to her, grounding himself in the moment. For the first time in a long while, he feels peace. The sun sets as Marcus walks away from the stage, scanning the faces of the people he has fought for. The battle isn't over, and he knows it. But for today, there is hope. There is progress. There is change. And as long as there is that, he will keep fighting.